Okay, so you just said in the last question about like the term spiritual abuse is getting more traction or whatever.
Right.
Why do you think that's happening?
Yeah, I think
maybe that's why I hadn't really heard of it before, because it was not a common. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I don't think you would have used.
Maybe I'm out of the loop.
Yeah. Well, no, I don't think the phrase was used probably as commonly as it is now.
Okay.
And so I think it probably it was used more for like extreme cases within the church. But I think now, especially with the deconstruction movement, and we've talked about the deconstruction movement before. It's just this idea of, especially the deconstruction movement away from evangelicalism, and so where you're actually taking and tearing down that things that you believed to re-examine them to find out if they're actually true or not. And I think that's what's led to a lot of it, of the commonality of the phrase, because people are now realizing that they felt spiritually manipulated or spiritually dominated or spiritually intimidated by their pastors or their leaders to believe, act, behave within a certain manner, that the leaders were overstepping their bounds. And so therefore they've started labeling that as spiritual abuse.
So do you think whenever people say they were spiritually abused, they were actually spiritually abused?
I don't know. I think,
has it gotten to the point where it's getting overused yet?
That's where I was trying earlier. I think it's overused now. Because I think we've told this too, like church hurt. Right? Like, it's one thing to be hurt. Like, in other words, someone hurt your feelings, someone didn't fulfill what they said they were going to do, or it's one thing to be hurt. That word abuse is a really heavy word. So if I'm going to use that word abuse, that word needs to carry weight with it, in my opinion. And I do think sometimes people can use the phrase there was spiritual abuse going on there, when maybe it was someone being a jerk, but they weren't being abusive. Someone, in other words, when I say jerk, in other words, they were being short with you, they were being, unkind, maybe too direct, whatever, micromanaging, whatever. I don't know if it's necessarily spiritual abuse. It might be spiritual hurt, maybe hurt from that. But again, that word abuse is a pretty heavy word. We wouldn't use that word lightly in family kind of situations, So I think we have to be careful to use how we use that word in church situations.
So if the pastor raises his voice at me for whatever reason, that's not spiritual abuse.
No. No, that could be the pastor losing his cool. Right?
But he's not trying.
Unless it's like a continual patterned behavior, right? Because I've raised my voice. And I've been short with people. But then I also want to own that and ask for forgiveness and repent from it. And I don't want it to be a standard, behavior for me. And so that's where I think we have to be careful with using these phrases and words. What do we really mean by that church hurt me, or that leadership was abusive? That's kind of a phrase I hear a lot. That's abusive leadership. What do we mean when we say that? And I'm not discounting the fact that maybe they're insensitive, or they're, not willing to listen, or they really don't like to be challenged, right? But are they abusive? And sometimes they can be.
Are you nervous as the word gets more prominent that people are going to start accusing you of spiritually abusing them for more things?
I think to be honest. I've never thought about it till right now. But I think anytime a word begins to catch on, because church hurt was a big thing, right? Everybody had church hurt.
Right.
Well, now if we're going to start using these phrases like spiritual abuse, that leadership was spiritually abusive, that's why I'm saying, I really want to know what you mean by that. Did they lose their cool with you one time? Were they kind of control freaks, micromanaging everything? And, or were they intentionally trying to manipulate you emotionally, or physically, sexually, Like, what are we talking about when we use the word?
Do you think that pastors can do stuff like this and not realize that they're doing it?
Yes,
okay.
I do, because I think sometimes pastors don't realize actually the position of authority they have.
Oh,
and what I mean by that is they may not realize that when they say something a certain way or do something a certain way, that it is actually representative of God.
Oh,
to them, to the person they're talking to, or the fact that they have a position of authority in the church, and therefore anyone else in the church may say the same thing and it not bother them as much, but because you, the pastor, said it, it carried way more weight and can be more hurtful.
Okay.
And so, yeah, absolutely. I think that pastors have to be careful with the way we use words and the way we say things. And we have to check ourselves, I think, constantly to make sure we're not trying to manipulate people to get our own way.